Hello, this is the second lecture of week 1, and our topic is motivation. If you can tell, I've been up all night and I'm wearing the same clothes, and it's now 6 p.m. and I was very motivated to get this lecture done. So bear with me. I'll try to finish it this evening. And today's lecture, which I know you've been waiting for, is on motivation. Why do you do what you do? I'll learn what an incentive is, what the different theories of motivation are, and about the different types of motivation. There's some very basic primal incentives that correspond to biological drives, and then there are more complex motivations, like those for inclusion and achievement. Your achievement motivation also includes your academic motivation, and I am looking forward to learning more about that from your assignment. Motivation is defined in your textbook as a need or desire that energizes and directs behavior. Now here's another definition. My father's a clinical psychologist, and he was a very academically motivated person. And he studied for his psychology degree 50 years ago by reading his textbook out loud and recording himself, and then he would play back that tape over and over again. And now you get to use that little robot voice in your ebooks. When I mentioned motivation to him, he spouted this off from memory, this definition, about 50 years after learning it, and I wrote it down while he spoke. And he said very confidently, "A motive is a supposition to the effect of a goal-seeking tendency that instigates, sustains, and directs a person's behavior towards an end state which is anticipated." What that means is that motivation is that force that drives you to do what you need to do to get what you want. We're motivated to eat when we're hungry. We're motivated to drink when we're thirsty. We're motivated to socialize when we're lonely. Psychologists are famous for teaching rats to press levers. And in order to get a rat to do that, you have to train the rat by rewarding it with some food for pressing the lever. Rats can also be trained to press a lever to avoid an electric shock. If you trained your cat to shake your hand with its paw, you would have had to have used treats to get it to do that. The power that you're tapping into to get the rat or the cat to do something you want to do is the animal's food motivation. The rat doesn't really care about the lever, and the cat doesn't really care about shaking your hand. They care about the food. Animals are, for very good reasons that are related to their survival and reproduction, naturally motivated to get food. And that is what you are leveraging to get them to do what you want. Food is the thing, the stimulus that motivates the behavior of pushing the lever, the behavior of shaking hands. Okay. What is a behavior? A behavior, and you need to know this because psychology is the scientific study of behavior. You need to know what a behavior is. A behavior is an action that someone can observe. So studying is a behavior. Someone could see you do that. Someone could watch you do that and say, yep, that person is studying. Sitting is a behavior. I'm sitting down right now. You can see that. But your inner thoughts and feelings aren't behaviors. Big concepts or ideas like happiness and sadness aren't themselves behaviors, but smiling is a behavior that could indicate happiness, or you could be fake smiling, right? And crying is a behavior that indicates or could indicate sadness, or maybe you have something in your eye. If you smile, other people can see you do that. It's an observable action. It's a behavior. Back to incentives. Incentives are the things that motivate someone to engage in a behavior. If you train a cat to shake your hands with its paw, you do that by teaching it that if it does this, it can get a treat, and it wants the treat, right? The cat doesn't care about the handshake. The cat will do whatever it needs to do to get the treat. It wants the treat. The treat is the incentive that corresponds to its food motivation. So in this case, it's a positive incentive. So we can have positive incentives and we can have negative incentives. A positive incentive is something that you or the animal likes and wants and is drawn to. But a negative incentive is aversive. We're motivated to get away from it. It's unpleasant or undesirable. So a jet of water from a spray bottle will teach your cat not to do something, like scratch the sofa. Okay, so the jet of water is a negative incentive. If the cat was thirsty, then water would be a positive incentive. Another example we use a lot in animal research is electric shocks. So rats can be trained to do things like push a lever in order to avoid having an electric shock, usually to the feet or the tail. In the context of this course, a grade of A is a positive incentive. If you are motivated to get an A, I can make you do things like watch this video in order to get it. Now, an F would be a negative incentive. I could also get you to do other things like hand things in on time in order to avoid getting an F. The fact that I control and administer those incentives in combination with your relationship to those incentives, say how much you actually care about getting an A or avoiding an F, is sort of the primary basis for my power. Would you be watching this at all if I wasn't grading you? For something to be an incentive, you have to want it, or at least want to avoid it. So treats are an incentive for a cat if the cat likes them, and typically they do. You cannot train a cat with treats if it doesn't like the treat or if it isn't hungry. So once the cat is full and wants to go to sleep, the treats lose their power as an incentive. Now maybe you lapse the incentive. And that power would be restored once the cat is interested in the food again. Food is just one example of a type of motivator. Other examples are safety, money, sex, social approval. You will do things to get other people to like you and stop doing them if you think other people disapprove. Shame is a potent negative incentive. Cats and dogs are different, and you might be able to train a dog to do something just by sort of petting it and showing your approval. And that's because dogs are social creatures, and they're naturally motivated to form and maintain social bonds, like people. Cats are not, and so you can't train a cat that way. A cat just wouldn't care. Call your cat's name, it probably won't come. Shake a bag of treats, and you'll get a very different behavior. And what research in psychology suggests is that cats do recognize their owners calling their names, they just don't care. Now let's talk about the different theories of motivation. The first is instinct theory, which takes an evolutionary perspective. Right? There are some behaviors that are species typical. There are some things that people do, and there's some things that cats do, and there's some things the rats do. And these instincts are fixed, unlearned patterns. If I shined my laser pointer in front of you, you might look at where I was pointing, but you probably wouldn't pounce on it and chase it around. That's a very cat behavior. A cat who has never seen a laser pointer will do that, and that's because the cat has a hardwired hunting instinct that motivates it to pounce on things that move, even if they aren't food. The cat doesn't need to be taught to do that. It's not a learned behavior. It's just part of being a cat. It's pre-programmed cat behavior. It's fixed in the sense that it doesn't change. The same pouncing behavior looks kind of the same, is shared by all cats around the world and down through the generations of cats. And the behavior has a fixed structure. So let's say it starts with watching, and then hunching up, powering up those muscles, and then identifying the opportune moment for a burst of attack activity. And it's always kind of the same set of moves. So that's what we mean when we say that an instinct is a fixed, unlearned pattern. The next perspective on motivation is drive reduction theory. So your body wants to stay in a nice state of homeostasis, a state of balance where you're comfortable and all your systems are working well. But if your body is somehow out of balance, say it's dehydrated, then that would create a drive in you, a drive that you need to satisfy. Let's say the drive of thirst. And then that motivates you to go and quench your thirst with a drink of water. That satisfies the drive, and you're back in balance and not interested in the water anymore. The idea is that we do things because we're motivated to reduce a drive, right? Hunger, thirst, sex, need for attention, so on. And then once the need is satisfied, you're no longer driven to engage in that behavior until things get out of balance again. Food is a motivator, but your food motivation works around a set point that your body has for your weight. We generally stay at a stable weight without having to think about it. Your set point for your body weight is the weight that your body wants to be at. And it works like a thermostat to keep you around that weight. So when your body weight falls below that point, increased hunger and a lowered metabolic rate would combine to help you restore that lost weight. And then if your weight were to rise too far above that point, and you get less hungry, your metabolism would speed up, and there are various hormones that accomplish that. For example, the fat in your body releases a hormone that tells your brain to turn down the hunger signals. Now, if you're interested, you can learn more about food motivation and sexual motivation in modules 32 and 33, but I'm not making you. For many people, dessert is an incentive. For many children, candy is a reward. We have a hardwired general preference for sweet and salty tastes. And that's because over our long evolutionary history, foods that taste sweet or salty have given us nutrients we need and generally not been poisonous. Many of us have a natural distaste. It's one that's particularly strong in children, say pregnant women who could be more harmed by ingesting a toxin, for bitter foods. And bitter foods can often be poisonous ones. Interestingly, people who live in warmer climates have a preference for spicier foods. You can see the adaptive value there because spices, even though they taste hot and can cause a bit of pain, do preserve meat quite well. If a food is healthy and nutritious, then it's adaptive to learn to like it, even if it tastes bad. And to come to like that taste, the fruit in the lower left corner of the slide is called a durian, and that fruit smells like rotting sewage. Normally, it's not a good idea to eat things that taste like that, but people learn to love it, and then that smell is a good smell to them, just like maybe blue cheese tastes good to you. The pictures on the slide include some culturally prized foods that you might not be naturally drawn to. There is a dead baby mouse wine from China, and rotting seal meat, natto from Japan. In the middle there is kazumarzu, and that's a Sardinian sheep milk cheese that is cultured with maggots that are eaten alive. It's traditionally eaten on a piece of bread, and you actually have to hold your hand over top of it because the maggots can jump about 10 to 15 centimeters. A lot of the cultural foods that people outside of a culture think are weird are foods that look or taste or actually are potentially dangerous. Insects, raw, rotting, fermented foods can be poisonous, and there's no adaptive value in pre-programming people to like those tastes. On the other hand, carnivores like cats and dogs are attracted to the very umami taste of rotting meat or feces or vomit, and dogs will eat that stuff quite happily. And in fact, pet food developers add chemicals representing those flavors to make those treats so appealing to your cat. They might not taste so good to you. There are also individual differences in what foods people find motivating, and some of those differences are normal, and some of them are more abnormal. Michael Letito was a Frenchman who liked to eat metal and sharp things. The condition that he had is known as pica, and it was diagnosed at age 9 when he started eating the family television set. He ate shopping carts, a car, airplane, but he really liked bicycles. He also ate a coffin, including the handles, and that may well be the only time a coffin ended up inside a man. He actually made this into a career, and he was ultimately awarded a brass plaque by the Guinness Book of World Records, which he ate. Then there are people who are motivated to eat too much or too little. So what's going on there? Well, maybe consider that it isn't really about the food per se. Maybe it's about what the food means. What can eating or not eating mean? Reward, comfort, control, purity, achievement. It's very hard to eat very little. Humans are very complex, and a cat will never have the same relationship with food and the meaning of food that a person can. But notice that the behavior is tied to more than the incentive of food as food. It's tied to the values the food represents and the narratives we tell about it. It's a very human thing. We can really see the role of culture in eating disorders. It's Western society that prizes thinness in women. In other cultures or other historical periods, heavier bodies have been favored. In this case, the motivation to eat or not eat, again, it isn't so much about the food per se, but maybe it's more about an affiliation or achievement motivation, say to be accepted, admired, to overcome challenges, or to reach an ideal. In Western culture, wealth and status are associated with lower body weight for various reasons, including the accessibility of food and the kinds of foods that people eat on lower versus higher incomes. And there's a saying among women that you can never be too rich or too thin. It's a very culturally situated thing to say. Now compare that motivational profile to women in Mauritania. That's a desert country in northwestern Africa where poverty and scarcity mean that obesity is a sign of wealth and status. So that kind of turns the tables. The beauty ideal for women there is to be very overweight, and things like stretch marks on the arms are seen as very desirable and beautiful. And being thin is stigmatized as looking ill, for example. Girls and young women will, like we do here, suffer to try to reach those ideals. So there are camps that families would pay for where the aim would be to have a young woman gain a lot of weight very quickly. They might use drugs to increase appetite and weight, and thinner women might find themselves teased or bullied or feel envious of their heavier peers. If you're interested in these topics and how to help motivate people to be healthy, you might be interested in the field of health psychology. That's a subdiscipline of clinical psychology. Health psychologists use their knowledge of psychological principles like motivation to help people meet their health goals. For example, living an active lifestyle, complying with treatment for chronic illnesses, which can be very complicated and challenging, and finding ways to change unhealthy behaviors, for example, stopping smoking or drinking. Advertisers appeal to our motivations to get what they want, just like the researcher might appeal to the rat's food motivation to get it to press that lever for the scientific study. And what the advertisers want, what do they want? Well, they want us to buy what they're selling. Sex is a motivator, and on average, men are more sexually motivated than women. That's a cross-cultural finding. So let's take a look at these car ads. And they're trying to sell a man an expensive car by suggesting that the car will attract women to him. So his sexual motivation is being exploited to get him to buy a car. In the BMW ad, they just skipped the whole car part and got straight to the sex. If you were to appeal to a man's sense of reason to sell him a car, you'd probably be selling him a 5 to 10-year-old used Toyota. And the margin on that would be slim. So if you want to sell him something that nets a really high profit margin, it's not going to be by appealing to his reason. Otherwise, he wouldn't let you do that. So you must instead engage his non-rational instincts. These are examples from Reddit of what sexual motivation has led some guys to do. For example, read Pride and Prejudice, take an arts degree. There's an account there from a man who pierced his own nipples. So in these cases, the incentive is to be with the woman. It's not the concert or the book or the piercing, right? And the behavior that they engaged in is really anything that will capture her interest and draw her to him. Okay, back to motivational theories. Arousal theory is the idea that there's a right level of arousal for your body and for your mind, and it's not, complete stillness or being super ramped up. So what does arousal mean? Arousal is the physiological, that means body, and psychological, that means mind, state of being awake and having your senses stimulated to the point that you're perceiving and experiencing things and engaged. So if you were asleep in this class, you would not be sufficiently aroused mentally or physical to understand this lecture, even though my words would be coming into your ears and possibly inspiring weird dreams. But now, let's take the opposite case. What if you were very aroused? What if you were so tense or anxious or hopped up on caffeine and jittery that you couldn't focus? That's too much arousal. According to the Yerkes-Dodson law, there's a right level of arousal for you to perform well on a task. And that level of arousal depends on the task. If you're doing something hard and complex for the first time, you'll do better if you're a bit less aroused than usual. But if you're doing something that you've mastered, then it actually helps to be a bit more aroused. And that's why experts perform better in front of crowds, while novices or people who are learning something might really mess up when they're being watched. Because having people watch you is a little stressful. It's a little arousing compared to being alone. Now, we've talked about electric shock as a negative incentive. Generally, people and rats are motivated to avoid them because they don't feel nice. But when researchers leave undergraduate volunteers in a room alone with nothing to do, and leave them alone with an electric shock generating device, the bored students eventually start shocking themselves. And that's because getting the shock is more interesting than doing nothing and relieves them from being bored out of their minds. We're motivated to engage in behaviors that bring us to the right state of arousal. So to the level that feels right. If you've had a stressful week, you might like a long, relaxing bath, not an electric shock. And you have to be really bored to want to play with those. Some of us are more naturally wound up or tense or anxious or aroused, and that trait is called neuroticism. And then some of us are simply more sensitive to stimulation. So the same level of a stimulus, say decibels of noise, will get a bigger reaction out of some people than others. So some of us are more sensitive to stimulation. Some of us are less sensitive. Introverts, who are people who need to be alone to sort of recharge, are more sensitive to stimulation. They're more easily overwhelmed and need to pull back to recover. If you give lemon juice to introverts, they salivate more than extroverts. The lemon tastes more sour to them and they produce more saliva in reaction. They're more sensitive. Right? So they're more motivated to do things to reduce that arousal level, like to stay home and chill on the couch. An extrovert might hate that. Extroverts, or people who are gregarious and social, tend to be chronically understimulated. And that's why they want to go out and party and engage with other people. Other people can be quite stressful. And do risky things like bungee jumping, for example. Okay? They're motivated to engage in more behaviors that increase the overall levels of arousal to the place that feels right for them. Our last theory is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is very well known, and therefore you should know of it. Consider this as an interesting idea or a framework for thinking about motivation. However, it's not an empirically or scientifically validated theory. The idea, which is pretty common sense, is that first we have to meet our basic needs for survival, for food and safety, before we're motivated to meet our higher order and more complex needs. Oh, if this is true, maybe it's like most theories in psychology, kind of true and kind of not true and sort of useful. And it's probably true that you can't focus on your studies if you aren't eating or sleeping well. But then we can also criticize this. We shouldn't see this as a sort of a universal law. Maslow's hierarchy labels sex as a need, but in fact that's a want, right? It can be a very powerful want, but you don't need it the way you need water or shelter. And I don't think it should be classified at the same level as air as it is in the figure to the right. Now, people have starved themselves to make a political statement that they believe in, or to save someone else by letting them have the food. That's like putting love ahead of your own physiological needs. And things like that have happened, for instance, in concentration camps. The top of the pyramid is self-actualization, and that means fulfilling your highest personal potential, living a fully meaningful life. This hierarchy would say that in order to do that, in order to say fulfill your calling, first you have to have had breakfast and paid the rent and be in a good place with your family and friends, and also have the opportunity to master skills and develop your confidence and achieve your goals. Abraham Maslow is a famous humanistic psychologist, and humanistic psychology, compared to other traditions in psychology, like the psychodynamic tradition, it is more about seeing the positive in people and looking at their potential for growth rather than trying to fix what's wrong with them, and asks how do environments support or limit growth and thriving. And it puts an emphasis on our needs for love and acceptance. Maslow's hierarchy was inspired by his experience with the Blackfoot people in Alberta. Now, Maslow had studied highly successful versus unsuccessful people. And so he studied people who he thought had really made it and looked at their biographies, and he studied people who were sort of down and out. And he came to believe that social hierarchies are maintained by dominance. And he wanted to test the universality of his theory. He wanted to see if it was true everywhere. So he went and stayed with the Blackfoot people in Alberta. And he found things that he didn't expect. He found a very different society that was more egalitarian. He found sort of high levels of cooperation and satisfaction. And social status seemed to mean different things, right? it was more defined by generosity to others than, say, personal wealth. And he didn't find any equivalents to the down-and-out people that he found in his society. He found a more supportive or community-oriented approach to managing deviant behavior. And it was his impression of what people were like there that led to this idea of what self-actualization means. Now, while Maslow was inspired by his experience with the Blackfoot people and their culture, it's his take on life and the world, and we could expect it to reflect his positionality. It's possible, I don't know, that this doesn't reflect the beliefs or the values of the Blackfoot people. They might say, no, you got this all wrong. Maybe, for all I know, what he's calling personal self-actualization is really some kind of representation of an individual in a healthy community. And if you look at his model, there's no role for social context. I don't know. I haven't looked into it, but it sounds like it could be a good honors thesis. Humans have a strong need to belong. That's our affiliation motive. If you had to define happiness in one word, it would be love. The need for love, in a sense of friendship and community, acceptance, inclusion, belonging, having other people around who care about you, is a major motivator of behavior. Love is a positive incentive, and exclusion, which we call ostracism, is a negative incentive. Humans are social animals, and our need to belong to a group is primal. Our ancestors didn't make it alone among the saber-toothed tigers by acting as individuals. Our history as a species is to live in pretty small tribal groups. Even now, we overwhelmingly don't have the ability to go and survive out there in the wilderness, right, without any help from anyone else. We're very interdependent. Even if you somehow found the means or the skills to survive alone in the wilderness, you might find yourself losing your mind from loneliness. Feelings of love and acceptance activate the brain's reward systems in the way that food does, and the experience of social exclusion is registered in the brain's pain centers. Your close relationships are the most important predictor of happiness. Not money, not fame, and perhaps paradoxically or ironically, not all of those things that we compromise our personal relationships for because we think that pursuing them will make us happy. Particularly in the workplace, most people feel unappreciated. So there's a lot of good you can do in recognizing and thanking people for what they do well. We as a culture are pretty inept at acknowledging and including each other. When we want to reward people, we often make it into a competition so that, one person wins, and this is the award winner, and then one person ends up with a totally disproportionate amount of recognition. And that might be a little unreasonable, and that effectively marginalizes all the people to help support them to get where they are. The individuals who we construct as personally successful typically have excellent support networks of people who aren't getting much credit in those narratives, but whose contributions are vital. People like competent assistants. Maybe there's someone taking care of the household. All the support staff, an IT, facilities, custodians. Sometimes those are people who are treated as if they were invisible. And so we might pile all the recognition and appreciation onto one person in a way that is very unequal. And then ignore everyone else so that they keep feeling unappreciated and possibly feel resentful. There is no need for that manufactured scarcity. We can afford to include and acknowledge each other more broadly. Your ability to recognize what other people do well and appreciate it genuinely is a considerable power, one that I assume you would use for good. It's a reinforcer that most people starve for every day and that you hold an essentially bottomless supply of. Look at that picture. They're not clapping for him, and he's not the center of attention. The person with the power in that picture is that guy. Try being that guy. Give that a spin. Let me know what happens. Social exclusion hurts. It's a potent negative incentive. We will do things or not do things to avoid being rejected. So it is used as a form of control or punishment. Think of solitary confinement, being expelled, being fired. Now, in the case of social bullying, and when I say social bullying, I'm talking about that kind of almost middle school style kind of bullying by groups against an individual target that uses gossip and malicious rumor spreading and exclusion. Social bullying is not about punishing or correcting somebody's bad behavior. It actually makes use of a lot of provocation tactics to get the target to break down and start acting like the angry, crazy, awful person nobody wants to work with or be friends with that they're being constructed as. People who are engaging in social bullying as perpetrators will do things that intentionally or instrumentally upset the target in the hopes that it'll elicit some kind of outburst that will result in further unwarranted rejection and punishment for that person. The people who are perpetrating it are demonstrating their power and their position in a social hierarchy or a pecking order. They're showing that they can peck and somebody can get pecked. And that feeling of having social status or power is a reinforcer in itself. Okay? So they're showing that they have control over the target, not only over their behavior and the reactions they're provoking them to, but also in sort of controlling their identity and their relationships. That's what gossip and rumor spreading do, right? They construct an identity for someone and get other people to react to that narrative, to treat the person as if the narrative were true. If you are ever in the position of being a target of social bullying, and I think it's important to know this because it is so common in the workplace, your best strategy is not to allow yourself to be provoked. It's to maintain your self-control in the face of provocation. And it can make that hard for you. It's certainly a challenge to respond to that with grace. But the alternatives can be worse. The alternatives can mean falling into traps that have been set for you and becoming distracted from your work. Social aggression is instrumental in that way. Another important source of motivation is achievement. Achievement motivation is defined as your desire for significant accomplishment, for mastery of skills or ideas, for control, and for attaining a high standard. Your mastery of your best skills and your application of those skills in pursuit of what matters to you is how you're going to leave your mark on the world. A textbook talks about a concept called grit, and it's defined as passion and perseverance in the pursuit of long-term goals. The book talks about it as if it's kind of a universal truth, but in reality, this is something called pop psychology. It's an interesting idea. Maybe it's like Maslow's hierarchy. Maybe it's a useful framework. Maybe you can get some good out of it. Maybe it's kind of true, kind of not true. I'm happy if you find it useful. However, this is not an idea that's strongly supported in the scientific literature. The idea of grit puts a lot of emphasis on personal responsibility, and it downplays environmental barriers that people can face. It's also based on a kind of circular logic. Like resilience, it sounds like a trait that's assigned after the fact. So you achieved this really difficult goal, so therefore you must have persevered, which is why you achieved the goal. And the fact that you couldn't keep practicing indicates that you don't have enough willpower, which is why you couldn't keep practicing. It's sort of circular. And a good theory isn't circular like that. This brings me to academic motivation. One kind of achievement motivation is your academic motivation, and that is your drive for academic functioning and success. How much effort you put into your studies, how well you regulate your work, what you choose to pursue, and how persistent you are when you're faced with obstacles. And I'm going to add, I don't think that getting an over obstacle is just about persistence. There might be some more strategic behavior there too. Many of you are motivated to change the world, and I think that's an excellent achievement motivation. I do want to say that the first people to challenge iniquities and step forward to accomplish significant change often do so at a great personal cost. It takes a lot of courage and a high tolerance for suffering and constant grace under fire. Some real grit, if you please, to do that. The motivation might not be so much for personal gain, but for a higher social good or a sense of justice. The first woman to get her PhD in psychology, that was Margaret Floyd Washburn, followed in the footsteps of another who completed all the work and yet was not given the degree. That was Mary Whiten Calkins. Mary Whiten Calkins put up with a lot in order for Margaret Floyd Washburn to be able to get her degree. That's Henry Flipper. He was the first black officer to lead a black regiment in the United States Army. These were historically led by white officers. And it's said that he served with competence and distinction. As one might expect, he encountered plenty of racism. He was the subject of constructive dismissal, which is one manifestation of social bullying in the workplace. It's basically sort of firing somebody through social bullying, rumor spreading, provocation. He was the target of a smear campaign. There were rumors of indiscretion with a white woman, and he was held to much higher standards than others and punished harshly for mistakes that white officers would have been let off the hook for. He was ultimately court-martialed and dismissed. He did leave some things differently behind him. He was ultimately pardoned posthumously in 1991, and his bust now inspires students at the school he once went to. My take-home message is that if you want to achieve great things, it may not be appreciated in your lifetime. Your sense of psychological success comes from setting and achieving small goals. You're most likely to actually achieve a goal if it's specific, so you can know what you're actually trying to do. If it's measurable, so you can know when you've achieved it. When it's achievable, it needs to be something that you can actually do, otherwise you'll defeat yourself. It needs to be realistic, so it needs to be something that makes sense in the real world and in your current context. Then you need to specify when you're to achieve it, to keep yourself on track. Bad goals are vapid goals. They're vague, they shift around, they're idealistic, have no personal meaning to you, and you'll never get around to doing them. Don't set goals like that. Last year, most students' grade goals for this course was to get an A. No one ever said they wanted to get a D or an F for a dropout, though the DFW rate for the course was 19%. It's in a class of 100, and that is an acceptable DFW rate for a large introductory course. My point is that most students had the goal of getting an A. Actually, most of them achieved that, but nobody intentionally planned to fail. When I asked students why they wanted to get the grade they identified, which was typically an A, it was a kind of achievement striving, getting an A for the sake of getting an A, because an A is a good and I can achieve anything I set my mind to. Only 15% of students had mastery goals. There are extrinsic rewards or motivators, and those are things that come from outside of you. So a grade is an extrinsic reward or an intrinsic motivator. And then there are intrinsic rewards or motivators, and those are the ones that come from inside you. Getting a good grade is an extrinsic motivator, but satisfying your own interest, desire for learning and personal development is an intrinsic motivation. Research shows that students with mastery goals are actually the ones who are most likely to end up with very high grades, sort of paradoxically, even though it isn't their primary motivation. And in my own experience as a teacher, students who end up in trouble for academic integrity violations, for cheating, are ones who just want the grade for its intrinsic value, right? They'll do anything to get that A, and some of those things aren't learning the material. It's actually possible to undermine people's intrinsic motivation by providing them with external rewards. If you have a child who loves to play the piano, if you started paying that child to play it, they might start to like playing it less and might stop or kind of give up if you stopped paying them. It starts being about the money. One of the reasons that I stopped using the adaptive learning assignments from Myers and DeWall, even though they seem to work, was because students were starting to find ways to get around really doing them, say looking at the answers on Google. Many of these sort of textbook publisher questions have their answers posted online. And when students started doing that to get the grade, because I made them worth, say, 0.5% each, they were no longer intrinsically motivated to use that tool for their learning. And so by saying this year that, this is a resource that might be useful to you and you can use it if you want it, I'm trusting that you'd be relying on your intrinsic motivation to learn to use it well. Other reasons that students had for their grade goal were, let's say, maintaining a certain GPA level, maybe to keep or get funding, or to get into professional programs in psychology. And those are all very valid reasons. If you want to achieve a goal, research in psychology suggests that it helps to make a clear resolution and to share it with others. Let your friends and family know. It's really important to have a plan and to monitor and record your progress so you can see if you're on track. It's also important that you're in a supportive environment. And finally, understand that it is normal to encounter barriers and obstacles, and that if you persist and act skillfully and strategically and adaptively, you can overcome them. Another important finding is to leverage the power of habit. We all have habits, and what's great about habits is they're things that you do on autopilot, so you don't really think about it. You don't put a lot of cognitive effort, you're not coming up against a lot of resistance in doing them. You do them naturally. So imagine if you could design your habits so that they were things that support your success, things that help you achieve your goals and stay healthy. How long do you have to repeat something to make it a habit, like drinking a glass of water? Research suggests that it is an average of 66 times. So if you think that you're going to start going for a jog every morning, don't be surprised if you don't develop that habit after you try it once or twice or 5 times or 10 times or 20 times, but stick with it and you can develop a habit. One of the questions on the assignment is, how do you plan to succeed in this class? That's because we know that it's important to have a good plan to achieve your goals. Here's an example of what I think is a really good student response, and from a student who was very successful. And look at the level of detail there, right? It's a weekly plan. A person knows what they're doing on Monday and Wednesday and Friday, and what they'll be doing, say, making personal notes from the reading, and then doing a big revision just before the quiz. I like that plan, and it worked too. Here's another one that I liked, and what I liked here is that the student recognized their own needs, and they recognized that they need quiet and a space for focus to get away from noise and distraction. They plan to identify a designated workspace and to cut back on some of the distractions in their life so that they can get the level of focus they need. So no one said that they wanted to get a D or an F or dropout, but about 19% did. I did notice that the students who failed the class didn't have great plans to succeed, and there's a saying that to fail to plan is to plan to fail, and I think that played out. So let's take a look at 3 examples. So number 1, the plan is, I will make sure I get everything done by the deadline. That's not a plan, okay? That's a goal or an intention. It's not telling me how they're going to achieve that, right? What are they going to do in order to get their work done? Where and when or how are they going to do that work? Here's the second one. The student said that they will get work done during downtime between classes. You shouldn't really do your coursework during a lecture, right? You want to be paying attention ideally. So really the only time that you can do your work is kind of between classes, and so it's not really saying anything at all. It's like kind of saying, I'll get work done when I'm not sleeping. When else are you going to do it? So that's another example of a kind of non-planned plan. And then the third example, the person said, I have a calendar and a planner. Okay, so the student identified a resource, and that's a good start. But we know that in order to succeed, you need to identify the resource and then use it adaptively. So what are you going to do with that calendar? How are you going to use it? A good example might be to block out 5 2-hour periods to get that 10 hours in. When I asked students last year why they were taking the class, it was heartening to see that about 80% were really interested. They wanted to learn about psychology, why we are the way we are, and do what we do. Most wanted to pursue a career in psychology. Most also wanted to pursue a career in psychology or figure out whether that would be right for them. and about half of those were interested in forensic psychology specifically. The students also wanted to apply the principles of psychology in daily life to help them understand themselves better and maybe be able to help others. A couple of people mentioned that the course was recommended by another student. Please be cautious about following through on recommendations like that, because there are multiple sections of big intro classes like this one, and the person making the recommendation might have taken it with someone else, and different instructors use different books. They have different course structures and different personal styles. So it could be, the recommendation could be about a completely different class, and just because something was a fit for someone else doesn't mean it will be a fit for you. Of all the students who come to St. Mary's in a given year, 60% of them will complete their degrees. Of the 40% who drop out, 25%, that's just a little bit over half of them, do so before second year in that first to second year gap. So I hope that we can give you the skills and the knowledge to bridge you over to second year. And once you get there, you'll be better positioned to take it from there. 90% of students who come to SMU do so because they hope their degree will lead to a good job. Maybe you don't want to spend your career as a retail sales associate. That's the most common job in Canada. And maybe this degree can lead you to a career and work that would be more motivating for you, where you could self-actualize. Overall, it is true that people who get degrees get better jobs. Often the people who make the decisions have degrees, and the people who live with those decisions don't. Maybe you want to be the ones making the decisions, and you want to be able to do that well. Now, that's not all the case. There are certainly many people who have great careers without university degrees. Entrepreneurs are an example. And in some fields like computer programming or construction, if you can clearly demonstrate that you have the skills, and that is ultimately what matters, you can get by without a degree. That brings me to the end of this lecture. You're welcome to post your thoughts, questions, comments, the class discussion. I think I'm going to put a prompt up. What is the weirdest food you've ever eaten? And of course, you're welcome to contact me privately as well. Deadline reminders. As a reminder, you have a quiz and an assignment, both I think easy, on Sunday at 5 p.m. If you're going to be asking for an extension, you need to do so by Saturday at 5 p.m. using the prescribed format in the syllabus. For next week, please see the readings under week 2 in the course schedule and the syllabus. I'm going to say that I'm uncomfortable with some of the content in Module 2 on culture and gender diversity. It struck me as having a bit of a sort of anti-male bias, and that's something that we can unpack in lecture. Until then, I'll wish you a good weekend.